Thank you guys for being here. I know after lunch, probably the last topic you wanted to talk about is something heavy like financial market infrastructure. Raise your hand, just out of curiosity, who actually works as part of their job in the FMI space? Anyone? Any clearing, settling, post-trade? Okay, for the record, that was everybody in the audience. You all raised your hands. So, well, we already introduced most of the panelists. Stanley, you keep on going back to back on different things. But just so we can level set with those of you who did not raise your hands, Stanley, could you just tell us real briefly, what is an FMI? Why are they important? And can you give us a description of, say, something like a CCP?
So a financial market infrastructure, which we call FMI for short, is a regulatory concept in a sense, right? So it's a significant infrastructure that provides for multiple parties to transact on financial transactions, right? So again, I'm using transactions, but this is systemically important enough that it gets a tag that designates it as an FMI. So these institutions...
Who designates these things to FMI?
It tends to be the regulators within the jurisdictions that they operate in. And then the tricky part is when it comes to cross-border FMIs, right, where you then have supranational types of arrangements that look at how systemically important these institutions are. And so the other term that the other acronym used was CCP. That's a central counterparty. And to the audience, this would be basically an exchange, right? So if you go to a futures exchange, one of the roles of the futures exchange is to act as a CCP. And this is to novate a trade. That means that if I traded with Tim, the two of us would have counterparty risk with each other, right? So if Tim walks away from the trade, I have two risks. One is counterparty risk, and if settlement was partial, then I also have some kind of principal risk. Now, the CCP steps in between, and what happens is when I trade with Tim, what I do is actually I trade with the CCP, and the CCP holds the counter position with Tim, so that there is no, well, so the risk is reduced, right? So it might handle some of that counterparty risk as well as the replacement risk of Tim just not doing the trade.
Sounds like Tim doesn't do all sorts of problems. So thank you for filling my name on that one. Pinar, you previously worked at, before State Street, you worked at LSEG, which is a type of clearinghouse, a type of CCP. When we're talking about FMI, why are we even here at this type of event? What does that have to do with this magical B word that everyone talks about?
Okay, so a few things about FMI. So FMI is actually one important point is there is a very specific meaning of an FMI. It's a regulatory term actually, and FMIs have been changing over time as well. Like if we actually look at the history of like how people actually behave in trading, trading is very, very peer-to-peer in its nature. So you just go and trade with someone you know, you exchange the goods and money, whatever it is, you settle there. So this whole FMI concept, like CCPs and so forth, are actually relatively new in the marketplaces. They are not, they weren't there before. They are basically kind of the results of really evolving financial services, like from its earlier days to, let's say, in the 80s or so, when you actually started seeing automation coming to the marketplace and more trades, and that actually led to more FMI concepts. And then really after 2000s or so, CCPs started getting organized as CCPs. So they haven't been there forever, right? So the point is, it's almost so we shouldn't really expect them to be there always, in the form that they have been there. And the reason for that is, as we are now going through another cycle, I think, of huge transformation in financial services, what we really can think about is, okay, is there a way that we can accommodate that peer-to-peer nature of transactions with the financial service infrastructures that we are more used to? So that's why I think we are really talking about. I mean, the analogy is this, right? It's a bit of a strange analogy I want to give, but this is completely off the path. But famous physicist Richard Feynman talked about nature being quantum mechanical, so needing, and we need quantum computers to actually understand the nature. So everything we have been doing so far has been really more force-fitting very, very peer-to-peer financial services to centralized structures. So we are here now, as we started talking about peer-to-peer systems, again, decentralized systems and technologies, we are here to think about, all right, so what does it really mean in the CCP states, for the CCPs, exchanges, for underlying CSDs, and so for the settlement depositories?
So, which ties into what you guys are doing at Clearmatics, Sarah, right? And just full disclosure, I'm an advisor over there. How do you guys came up with the term dFMI, which is actually the name of the panel. So we've talked about what FMIs are. We talked about CCPs. What exactly are you guys trying to do with the market structure and how the business builds around the technology and vice versa?
So the thesis towards decentralized financial market infrastructure is not, it's not to take away the financial market infrastructure status that some of these entities have. It's not to take away some of the functionality which actually improves efficiencies. But it's more about the decentralization of the risk that some of these entities have. That obviously the name Central Clearing Party indicates that it's centralized. But it also provides quite a lot of functionality around netting trades, and it reduces risk, as Stanley said, in between Stanley and Tim. But actually, if they're giving up all of their trades, and that happens across the market, everyone is facing this central counterparty. So the risk that everyone has with this central counterparty becomes systemically important, which is how it gathers its FMI status, basically. So the thesis behind decentralized financial market infrastructure is to use the technology that's now available to us, the B word, distributed ledger technology, if you will. It's to use this technology to kind of automate some of these processes, yes, and reduce some of the risk, yes, but also keep the mutualized risk that the bilateral trades actually have with each other. Each counterparty enters into a bilateral trade and has a particular risk against that other counterparty. As Stanley said, the credit risk, counterparty risk, replacement risk, and replacement cost. But all of that is currently centralized in one entity, and the thesis is to use technology to actually decentralize some of that.
Okay, so Stanley, you had a chance, we were co-authors with Pinar and Sara on an upcoming paper, and you had a chance to look through it, and I know the audience hasn't had a chance to it either, but let's keep some simple ideas from there that would be easy to discuss, including incentive alignment. There's a set of incentives that these CCPs or these different types of FMIs have, and over time, those incentives have changed such that they end up either taking on more risk or they become more concentrated just because of how the mergers and acquisitions have taken place over the last 20, 30 years. Just quickly, how could you explain the current incentives today as for-profit actors versus being say, a mutualized nonprofit or even a for-profit entity? Have you noticed that change or the shift take place?
So, well, this is a tricky question in that the incentives, okay, so let's go back to basics, right? Tim tends to speak a bit fast, so let me try to break it down a bit. So
you can Tim-splain it, it's okay.
So incentive alignment can mean many things to different people. So the thing is, when it comes to getting your salary, oftentimes when we talk about incentive alignment, it means that you get some of that salary in terms of stock options, right? So that your incentives are aligned as a manager to the success of the company. So i.e. the company's stock price rises because of certain management actions that you take, and therefore you want to keep taking the right actions in order to drive the stock price up because you're remunerated in that sense. Now, coming to something like a CCP, when you talk about incentive alignment, then it depends on what your objective is, right? What is it that we are trying to align the incentives towards? What kinds of good behavior we want to drive out of it? And so from your paper, one of the things that I believe drove the idea behind a dFMI was that you wanted to make sure that people traded responsibly, in a sense, right? So that they took risk that they were able to pay for.
So proportionality, right?
Proportionality, as well as the fact that you might have the cost of a busted trade, for instance, would fall back on the entities that were conducting the trade. But then one of the questions I had was, then what is the value of the CCP, right? Because the CCP exists really to allow for trades to fail and still protect the counterparty that didn't withdraw from the trade or didn't collapse. So in that case, because I'm the one who gained from the role that the CCP played in that, does it mean that I pay some form of insurance to it? You know, is this a mutualized pool of insurance that I'm going to pay to each time I undertake a trade? Then one of the thoughts around that was this could take the form of a tax, right? A Tobin tax in a sense.
What is a Tobin tax?
So a Tobin tax was from an economist called Tobin. That is a tax that's proportional to the size of the trade that you're taking, right? So in FX, so that it reduces the amount of speculation, useless speculation that might result in overly high volatility in the marketplace. So if you look at some of the interpretations of what risk is, it is tied to high volatility. So in this case, then applying something like a Tobin tax-like thing, and then taking that tax to fund an insurance scheme, a premium, that then collateralizes the CCP, basically capitalizes the CCP to absorb some of the losses that come about when, say, one of the counterparty fails, and then they have to step in to make good on that trade. That could be an idea, right? So then does that fulfill then the objectives of the dFMI was one of my questions. That is this really a technology issue, or is this really designing a insurance scheme properly? Which is not, you know, absent the technology, you could conceivably do this without having blockchains, without doing something.
Oh, you said the B
That's
word.
okay.
You're not supposed to do that.
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, we're trying to go the whole panel without saying that word, and it's kind of hard.
Yeah.
So speaking of just whether or not it's a matter of technology or not, I know that obviously you guys have views at IBM using mainframes for certain projects, but Pinar, do you feel that would you agree with that assessment that it's not that it is a matter of just business structure, or does technology actually have a role to play in setting up new types of clearing and settling these post-trade entities?
Okay, so I mean, okay, so in terms of the like using existing technologies, right? I mean, yes, you can actually probably think about using existing technologies to actually build this new paradigms that we are talking about. I mean, I wouldn't really necessarily dismiss that, but the issue is, I mean, it's really going back to my analogy. Why are we really trying to force fit, given the tools that we have, force fit, you know, a marketplace, and you know, if you look at force fit a marketplace which is intrinsically peer-to-peer, to more to the technologies that are really older in terms they are not necessarily peer-to-peer, and so that's not so the point is I think what's going to happen is we are not going to be there 100% completely peer-to-peer, decentralized, like this whole new world that's actually going to be like in every layer of the transaction cycle using these peer-to-peer structures, because that's very, very hard. What we're going to do, I think, is we're going to use some layers that are going to be maybe on mainframes, but force-fitted still, I would argue, and to look like more peer-to-peer at the end of the day. Maybe not. Maybe these layers are not supposed to be peer-to-peer. That's also possible. But we are going to end up with a hybrid roadmap. Is the point. So I think I wouldn't necessarily dismiss that you can the opportunity to use these technologies. I mean, the existing technologies. But why would we do that?
So one of the questions here is, okay, if we substitute cloud technology for mainframe, right? Because that's really what we are talking about here. That a huge think conceptually of the data center that provides cloud services has a gigantic mainframe, okay? Now, if all of us were housing our services there for resiliency purposes, for business continuity purposes, then we could implement a lot of this overlay of a peer-to-peer-like network that runs in the data center. It might be the same data center, but conceptually could be 2 data centers for resiliency, for redundancy over geography. Then is that enough to meet the objectives that you're talking about?
Well, I think there's sort of 2 angles to it, and very often you use a technology to solve a particular problem, but also there's the other angle to that technology enables new things too, and sometimes that drives the direction. And to go back to the history of central counterparties, it started in the 19th century with commodities trades like coffee, and it actually existed as a way to lower the cost to transact, which is a good thing. So people used to trade with one another and actually meet in this central location at a certain time so that they could settle their trades with one another. That's great. And then technology kind of has evolved, and a lot of this is actually, technologically solved now. But then you have this whole kind of infrastructure that emerges from that, and you end up with this kind of emergent pattern of, well, here's another problem in the market, okay, let's do this, let's do that, and some things are mandated by regulation, and actually now we've got to a point from the 19th century to this very day where there's a huge amount of various different securities that regulators are saying is necessary to clear through a central counterparty. And they actually, central counterparties, to their credit, actually fared quite well in the global financial crisis, which is why the regulators have kind of mandated more and more securities to be cleared through this. So there's a slight problem with concentration in the market. The Bank of International Settlement, around 2014, 83% of central counterparties were owned by the exchanges. So then you have this kind of going back to the alignment problem.
Yeah,
There's incentives for exchanges that, somebody does a trade on an exchange, and the exchange used to mandate that would be cleared through the central counterparty that they own. And actually, there's quite a lot of regulation now that's MiFID II in Europe that's mandated that that's not necessary anymore, and exchanges aren't actually allowed to mandate which clearinghouse a trade should be cleared through. So there's lots of this kind of evolution of the way things are structured and the technology that goes hand in hand. And so all of this is sort of pre-blockchain, pre-B word. And I think partly, Tim's shaking his head.
Doing so good, and then you use the word.
Yeah, sorry. But now we have a different technological paradigm in a decentralized peer-to-peer way, where you can have a network of peer-to-peer counterparties that can trade with one another, and that can be executed, cleared, and settled all in one transaction. I think that's what cryptocurrencies have taught us, that actually you don't need all these separate layers of infrastructure anymore. Whilst you can still, using the technology, mutualize some of that risk.
So part of the clearing process in a CCP type setting is calculation of things like initial margin, variation margin, and so on. So perhaps it's valuable for us to, for maybe you could explain how this might work in a decentralized context. Like how would I post it? Who do I post it to? Where does it live? That sort of thing.
Give us the real details, okay?
Well, I don't see why this can't be possible. And again, it's a technology to solve a particular solution, and one suggestion is using distributed ledger technology or blockchains to actually execute on some of this operational necessity.
Why not just use one big server?
IBM mainframe, for example.
Or not a server, but a serverless function, right? Those like AWS Lambdas or something like that.
But it's not about only cloud, is it? Like, if you actually start walking that route, I think it was oversimplifying. You have all these cryptographic key tools and the ideas around joint custody, like all of these things that you can do with the keys. And we're really, if you dig deeper into it, it's not only about cloud. It's not only about just peer-to-peer at the high level. At the details, you actually have so many new tools that you can implement to, for example, unlock collateral when you want to unlock collateral, only when you want to unlock collateral, things like that.
Well, I have a question. Since we're trying to talk about how do you build these things, why not just use something? I believe you were having lunch with someone talking about DeFi. And on the panel yesterday, Colin and I were making jokes about, like, there's no consensus on what DeFi is. But what's to stop somebody from the audience saying, oh, so you want to reduce concentration risk of how post-trade processes work. Why not just put it on, say, the Ethereum mainnet? What would be your response to that, Sarah?
Why not just go full DeFi?
Go full DeFi.
So there are some good things about regulation. I know that may be an unpopular opinion to the DeFi people out there, but certain things like investor protections, and I think investor protection is good. I think having to give up your trade to a CCP that centralizes all of that risk and becomes a systemically important entity, that is the complete opposite end of the spectrum. I mean, in terms of how you'd build these things, it's anyone's guess, you know, but there's using a blockchain with a sort of peer-to-peer base layer, as Pinar said, is a solution. In terms of calculating initial margin, those kind of calculations, any sort of smart contract would be able to do that. But I think part of the problem is some of these bilateral trades, uncleared OTC derivatives, for example, they don't have a standardized margin calculation rule. Some securities do and others don't. But there is a move in the market to actually move towards some of the standardization of that calculation. And there's certainly various different securities that would clear, that are traded, cleared, and settled, that do have standardized margin calculations. So all of that can be entirely automated. And automation and whether you change the financial market infrastructure or the infrastructure layer of that are two separate questions.
So just as long as we're, to be even-handed, so that we're not seeing as being quote unquote shills for just dFMIs, whatever those may be in practice. Stanley, you made a note regarding multilateral netting and things like trade compression, and how, as well as cross-margining agreements. Is there a need for dFMI in that process, or can you use existing CCPs? What is that future world in which you actually are able to get? Is there like a best of breed, best hybrid?
Right. I think there's certainly, like Sara says, a lot of standardization that's coming online, and that's about homogenization of standards and models, and things about trade compression already today demand that you have at least an agreement between us before we can compress this trade, right? So that I don't think is dependent on the underlying technology, whether peer-to-peer or centralized, that you're running on, because we can do this already, and it's already bilaterally negotiated, even if it is then cleared and settled onto a CCP, right? So I think, like Sara is saying, that's a separate layer. But where I have a question in my mind is that, how do we, is it part of the role and the function of the dFMI to build up that negotiation layer as well, that, when we negotiate, is that going to go as part of the dFMI, or is this going to be something that can be parallel, a separate system entirely, and then where you can plug and play different things? Or is this going to be an all or nothing kind of proposition?
I mean, it doesn't have to be. I think that there's certainly a question around interoperability around these systems. And if you are going to have multiple different systems, which I think is good for financial markets to have multiple different systems, I think in terms of resiliency, it's generally good for anything to have multiple different implementations.
Yeah, so actually, I know, not to steal too much thunder from Richard in the next panel, I believe his panel is actually about interoperability and enterprise-related stuff. What do you actually mean by, I know you've written about the single points of trust, single points of failure, and especially regarding mono implementations. What does that actually mean, especially for a crowd at which you have different quote-unquote cryptocurrency platforms or protocols that have some where it's mono implementation like Bitcoin, and then multi-implementation with a spec for, say, example, Ethereum. So what do you actually mean when you say that interoperability?
Interoperability. Yeah, I mean, it's, I think hopefully Richard would take us through what his view on interoperability is after this panel.
We throw some shade at him real quick, too, somehow.
Hi, Richard. From our perspective in Clearmatics, it really does mean a trustless version of interoperability. So I guess there's a couple of options. You could potentially use a bridging coin. You could use an intermediary node, or you could use a protocol. So protocol where two systems which are known to each other, for example, would be able to provide proofs to each other that something happened and then trigger an event from that. I'm trying to be as kind of general as possible, but that would mean for two different systems that you'd be able to do a trade and settle the delivery leg of that security and also the cash leg without having to go through various different systems or introduce a single point of failure into that.
So, but there I have a question about what interoperability, and I think, Tim, we spoke a little bit this morning about backward compatibility, right?
Are they the same thing? Yeah, what's that nuance?
Right, because, and this was posed as one of my questions, was today we have CCPs that are centralized, and then we have some that become dFMIs. Some activity may move to dFMIs. And then we're going to be in a hybrid state of the world where we have dFMIs and we have CCPs, traditional CCPs. Now, there's going to be a point in time, therefore, where they have to coexist and interoperate in a sense, or really, they may coexist with certain other legal arrangements that allow for transactions to still happen, right? Which need not be interoperability in a technical sense. It's just legally compatible. So the question I have is it vital, therefore, to have technical interoperability of the sense that you're talking about, like a bridge or whatever? Because it seems to me that even with a bridge, that's a bridge. That's still a central point of failure, right? That one bridge could be.
Well, I mean, it depends how you construct the bridge, but there are potential situations where, yes, that bridge would be a central point of failure. But, I mean, I think this is where kind of what I was talking about before in terms of emergent properties and emergent behavior from a system that's evolved over time. I think using technology now, we're in a position where we'd be able to redesign some of that and automate some of the processes to remove some of the operational inefficiencies. But I mean, to your question about whether dFMI and CCPs can coexist peacefully, I have no doubt that they can. I mean, there's different CCPs that coexist peacefully currently, whether that's in different jurisdictions or they specialize in certain different securities that they'd clear, that does coexist. And there is an interoperability argument around CCPs, not argument, discussion maybe, discussion around whether CCPs are interoperable. In other words, if we do a trade, can you decide to clear or give it up to one CCP and I decide to another one, which actually creates a risk in between those central counterparties. And that is entirely, well, it's not really a technical issue, it's a legal definition issue. And, you know, code is not law, but those things can be codified. And it's, a lot of what we're talking about is digital representations of assets or agreements on chain. It's certainly not native tokens like cryptocurrencies.
Can I just step back a moment? Because, look, I think these are converging concepts. I was at a conference 2 days ago in Mumbai. It's a very, very traditional, major annual clearinghouses and exchanges conference, especially derivatives conference. And the major discussion there is the systemic risk of CCPs. This is a very important topic. You know, the story that we talked about since 2008, you know, is a well-known topic in the traditional world as well. I was on a panel talking about these kind of topics, which is digital assets, crypto assets, and so forth. The point is, it's almost like these two worlds are really actually converging. You have the traditional financial market infrastructures looking at things that are not necessarily working quite right now. And then, you know, we're all kind of looking at these crypto assets, digital assets, tokens, and new forms of assets where we can actually represent them with keys and so forth. And what does it mean? When we create them, I mean, are we going to be creating them in the traditional infrastructures? Or are we thinking about new ways of going about that? And then I think on-ramps, off-ramps come up as the major challenge in this whole picture, really. And on-ramps, off-ramps are not about technology only. It's really technology, operations, access points, all kinds of things like that. So I think we will see typical, and we already have it indeed, like some of the decentralized systems, some of the CCPs, coexisting for a while. But I guess what we need to really sit back and think about is this dFMI concept is really a proposition. for us to think about how to actually break it into pieces, go back to the first principles of trading, and what is really needed, what can be centralized, what needs to be centralized, what should be actually distributed and decentralized. So those kind of things, and use the tools to actually visualize a new marketplace, because we have the opportunity right now, we are working on it already in DeFi space or so forth, and they are converging. I think that's kind of the proposition. So to the point about negotiations, for example, does it need to be part of it? Yeah, it's a design issue, right? Question. Maybe yes, maybe not, and when we go to that. And that's the point
So I know for the sake of time, we don't have much. So I'll propose this last question for all of you. So IBM, Stanley, with IBM, you guys just launched Global Wire, congrats, and you guys over at Clearmatics are working on USC. So both of them are slightly different approaches, or actually there are different approaches because you guys are using commercial banks, you guys are using working with central banks, and Pinar, you guys are basically, State Street's basically the largest custody bank, at least in North America, if not the world. So the question to you is assuming irrespective of how dFMI, whether one's created or not, do you need to have a on-chain cash solution? People call it cash on ledger, the cash leg. So is this settlement asset, as it were, for on-chain settlement finality, is that important? And if not, why not? Or if so, why so? I'll start with Stanley.
So an on-chain representation of cash is clearly convenient and would be useful in reducing certain risk, like Herstatt risk, right? Settlement risk. Because you would otherwise require some other technical way, like the bridge, right? The bridge concept, and that bridge will always be vulnerable. Unless the two assets are side by side in the same code base, it's really hard to ensure that you have an atomic swap or atomic operation between the two of them. So I think that that's a net benefit, but whether this is the thing that is absolutely essential before people adopt such systems, that's really left to the marketplace.
Yeah, so in the most simple sense, the picture is you have these assets, and then you have the financial market infrastructure, like decentralized or not, and then you have the underlying payment rail, really. And it's quite important. It's a journey. It's not going to be perfect in the first pass, right? But it does make sense to have cash on ledger, because if you're actually imagining a world which is already on the ledger, right? So, and then in that picture, the cash could be many different types of cash. And this is actually interesting. Like, maybe simplest way of looking at it is one way of looking at it, may not be the only way of looking at it. You have cryptocurrencies, you have central bank digital cash, and you have USC somewhere closer probably to central bank digital cash, and then you have all the stable coins backed by all sorts of things somewhere in the middle. But then imagine this, with different risk profiles, with different access profiles, and maybe use cases which are actually plugging into the rest of the whole financial market infrastructure, which is quite interesting, actually. I think, that's the direction of travel. That I think is exciting that we're going
So
to.
State Street coin, is that a yes?
No, I didn't say that at all.
Yeah, I agree with Stanley for obvious reasons. I do think that cash on ledger is absolutely vital for this. Again, I would echo the question of whether it's absolutely necessary to drive adoption or whether there's various different ways that we can progress and evolve ahead of that. I think yes, but I think eventually you have to move to a system where you do have cash on ledger, otherwise you still end up with the same risks that we have today.